scientists. I went to college to be a scientist, and then somehow I went off into religion and ethics. I started out with kind of a big picture of the sort of mess we're in. I just want to give a couple of bullet points about that. The drought is now measured in decades, not years. That rainfall from big storms is now measured in feet, not inches. In August 2019, Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas was, and I'm quoting now, the longest siege of violent, destructive weather ever observed. Since 1950, the number of floods in the world has increased by 15 times, extreme temperature events by 20 times, and wildfires by 7-fold. Persistent high temperatures are wreaking havoc with our forests. Fire season, on average in the United States, is 78 days longer. In California, it's 365 days a year. And today, Pacific Gas and Electric is likely going to shut off electricity for the next 48 hours to about 50% of California because of the concern for those electrical connections I'm about to say. In a time such as this, I want to ask you to ponder your own personal calling. I want to ask you to ponder, what is the calling of your faith community in a time such as this? It can't be that churches, synagogues, and mosques essentially have the same calling today as they had 50 years ago. That can't be. And that's because for the previous 6,000 years during which religion in a organized way has existed, we had continuity of creation. That's gone. And therefore, religion needs to find a new vocation. If that sounds like a big deal and something that people in this room might bring back home to their communities of faith, you're hearing me correctly. And then I want to argue as well that humanity itself now has a vocation. What are the characteristics of this new vocation? Courage. Courage is the first quality. It's no longer optional. Courage is required. Serving as a denominational leader in a time of profound systemic injustice and increasing discontinuity, I'm convinced that God is calling people of faith to speak with a clear, bold, truthful, and prophetic voice in a time of climate crisis. Urgency is the second quality. And no one communicates urgency better than 16-year-old Greta Thunberg. She's focused on climate change since she was 8 years old. In August 2018, she embraced a new vocation. Think of it that way. She's a 15-year-old, right, who is autistic. And instead of going to school, she goes out with her sign in front of the Parliament for a day. That's a new vocation. That's the frame. As this, we must acknowledge that the continuity of creation upon which thousands of generations of humans have sought moral progress, that is over. And one thing more, we must recognize that the existential dread we experience can serve as a precondition of hope. Once we have a safe enough context in which we can share our dread with trusted friends, by the grace of God, the Holy Spirit will ignite in us a tenacious and defiant hope. We also need to preach about climate change. So I invite you to challenge your clergy. We need to be hearing from the pulpit about climate change at least once a month. If we don't, I could say something more about this, but on a regular basis, when I was head of the UCC in Massachusetts, I had the authority and the privilege of convening groups of clergy. And I would tell them, if we don't start doing that, then within 10 years, all of our sermons will be on grief. Block that. Here's a fourth theme, and it relates to what I just said. We need to make civil disobedience a normative expression of faithfulness. I think the kind of responsibility required to bring children into the world, knowing what we now know, is totally different than the responsibility that was required to bring children into the world for all previous human generations. And that being the case, if that's not a conversation that's happening in the context of our houses of worship, in which we are attempting to understand, God's advice for us in our lives, if that's not a conversation happening in those houses of worship, then what good are they? So to me, it's as profound a question as there is, and I appreciate